The Mellon Scaife dynasty possessed a fortune vast enough to buy sovereign nations, yet it could not purchase them a single hour of peace. Instead, this bloodline is a crime scene of emotional violence spanning generations. It originates with Sarah Mellon, the lonely heiress who retreated into a fortress of solitude, ending her days surrounded by empty liquor bottles rather than family. But the poison didn't die with her. It metastasized in her son, Richard Mellon Scaife. He was a paranoid tyrant who spent a lifetime buying political influence while waging a private war against his own wife and children, and it culminates in the ultimate betrayal. Two heirs discovering their father had looted their trust funds, stealing millions, not out of financial need, but out of pure, vindictive spite. This is the autopsy of a family that didn't just fall apart. They cannibalized each other. The tragic childhood of a billionaire. Richard Mellon Scaife was born on July 3, 1932, into a world that was less a family and more a hermetically sealed ecosystem of limitless wealth and absolute emotional poverty. His mother, Sarah Cordelia Mellon, was the granddaughter of Thomas Mellon, the founder of the banking dynasty that rivaled the Rockefellers. She was one of the richest women in the world, a figure of icy elegance who moved through life, trailing the scent of expensive perfume and gin. His father, Alan Scaife, was a handsome, capable man from a good industrial family. But within the walls of the Mellon Empire, he was essentially a high-functioning employee, a consort who had married into a fortune so vast it rendered his own achievements meaningless. From the moment he took his first breath, Richard was an object to be managed, not a child to be loved. He was raised in Penguin Court, a sprawling, fantastical estate in Ligonier, Pennsylvania, that stood as a monument to his mother's eccentricities and neglect. The estate got its name from Sarah's most bizarre indulgence, a colony of 10 king penguins she had purchased from Admiral Richard Byrd's Antarctic expedition. For the young Richard, the reality of Penguin Court was a surreal nightmare. The penguins were allowed to roam freely through the mansion and the grounds. They were fed fresh fish daily, shipped in on ice, while servants followed them with mops to clean up the mess. Richard grew up watching his mother shower more affection on these flightless birds than she ever showed him. The penguins had their own refrigerated room. Richard had a nanny. The penguins were hand-fed. Richard often ate alone in the nursery. It was a lesson in hierarchy that he absorbed into his bones. In the Mellon Scaife household, amusements ranked higher than people. But the true ruler of the house was not the penguins. It was the alcohol. Sarah Mellon was a severe alcoholic. Her drinking was not the raucous, social drinking of the jazz age. It was a dark, solitary medication. She drank to numb the boredom of a life where she never had to work, strive, or earn anything. Richard grew up watching his mother disappear by early afternoon, her speech slurring, her temper becoming brittle and cruel. She was a functional drunk in public, poised, charitable, the grand dame of Pittsburgh society. But in private, she was a ghost, present in body but absent in spirit. This emotional vacuum created a monster. Without parental discipline or affection, Richard became a terror. He was a golden child who knew from a very young age that he was different from the staff who cared for him. He was a bully. He tormented the children of the servants, using his status as a weapon. He realized early on that there were no consequences for his actions. If he broke something, it was replaced. If he hurt someone, they were paid off. He learned that money was a solvent that could dissolve any problem and erase any guilt. In 1941, at the age of 9, an event occurred that many biographers believe permanently altered his psychology. While riding on the estate, Richard was thrown from his horse. He suffered a severe skull fracture. He lay in a coma, hovering between life and death. When he woke up, he was different. The already volatile boy became prone to dark, unpredictable rages. His temper became volcanic. Whether this was the result of traumatic brain injury or simply the calcification of his spoiled nature is a matter of debate, but the result was the same. The boy who emerged from the coma was colder, angrier, and more dangerous. As Richard entered adolescence in the late 1940s, his parents did what the wealthy have always done with problem children. They outsourced him. He was sent away to Deerfield Academy, a prestigious boarding school in Massachusetts. But Richard did not fit in. He was not the jovial, athletic scion of a happy family. He was brooding, awkward, and intensely private. He carried the shame of his mother's drinking like a physical weight. When his parents visited, they often arrived in a cloud of liquor fumes, humiliating him in front of his peers. He began to drink himself. At Deerfield, he developed a reputation not as a scholar, but as a troublemaker with a taste for alcohol that mirrored his mother's. He was expelled from Deerfield for drinking, a massive disgrace for a family that prided itself on appearances. It was the first public crack in the golden facade. But for Sarah Mellon, her son's expulsion was not a wake-up call. It was an annoyance. She used her influence to get him into another school, and then eventually into Yale University in 1950. She didn't care about his character. She cared about his credentials. She wanted a son who looked the part of a Mellon heir, even if the person inside the suit was rotting. By the time Richard arrived at Yale, the mold was set. He was 18 years old, heir to a fortune he hadn't earned, raised by a mother who preferred penguins to children, and armed with a skull fracture and a drinking problem. He was a young man filled with a chaotic, undirected rage, a rage against his mother, against his father's weakness, and against a world he felt judged him. He was alone in a golden cage, and he was beginning to realize that the only way to feel powerful was to hurt the people around him. Yale University in the early 1950s was the training ground for the American elite, a place of secret societies and privilege. For Richard Mellon Scaife, it was just another extension of the golden cage, but one with fewer keepers. Freed from the immediate gaze of his mother, Richard's behavior devolved from mere sullenness into something more chaotic. He was not interested in academics. He spent his time drinking, brawling, and nursing a growing sense of entitlement. His time at Yale ended abruptly and ignominiously. He was kicked out. According to some accounts, it was for a drunken prank that went too far. Others suggest it was academic failure. Regardless, he returned to Pittsburgh not with a degree, but with another mark of shame on his record. His father, Alan Scaife, perhaps attempting to instill some discipline into his wayward son, secured him a place at the University of Pittsburgh. Here, closer to home and under tighter supervision, Richard managed to graduate. But the degree did nothing to fix the void inside him. He was a young man with no career, no passion, and a massive inheritance waiting in the wings. In 1956, at the age of 24, Richard did what was expected of a man of his station. He got married. The bride was Frances Ritchie Gilmore. She was appropriate, pretty, socially acceptable, and seemingly docile. To the outside world, it looked like the union of a young prince and princess. But from the start, the marriage was hollow. Richard did not view Ritchie as a partner. He viewed her as an acquisition, another prop in the stage play of his life. He treated her with a cold, possessive detachment. He was already beginning to exhibit the controlling behaviors, the jealousy, the silences, the sudden rages that would later define his relationships. The couple settled into the predictable rhythm of the Pittsburgh upper class, charity balls, country clubs, and board meetings. But beneath the surface, the Scaife family was rotting. Sarah Mellon's alcoholism had progressed from a private vice to a terminal condition. By the early 1960s, the Grand Dame of Penguin Court was a shadow of herself, her body ravaged by decades of gin. The dynamic between mother and son during these final years was a study in mutual resentment. Sarah controlled the money, and she used it to keep Richard in a state of suspended adolescence. She refused to give him any real responsibility in the family's philanthropic foundations. She treated him like a child who couldn't be trusted with the keys to the car. Richard in turn watched his mother's decline with a mixture of disgust and anticipation. He hated her for her weakness, for the penguins, for the neglect, but he also knew that her death was the only thing that would set him free. In 1965, the end finally came. Sarah Mellon Scaife died of cirrhosis of the liver at the age of 62. Her death was the seismic event that shattered the glass walls of Richard's cage. It was not a moment of grief, it was a moment of transfer. When the will was read and the trusts were unlocked, Richard Mellon Scaife inherited a fortune that is difficult to comprehend. He received roughly $200 million in 1965 dollars, equivalent to over $1.8 billion today, along with control of several family foundations worth hundreds of millions more. But the most critical part of the inheritance was the control of the 1935 trust. This trust, established by Sarah 30 years earlier, was designed to skip a generation. It was intended to provide income for Richard during his life, but the principal, the core fortune, was supposed to be preserved for his children, Jenny, born 1963, and David, born 1966. It was a sacred financial vessel, meant to ensure the Mellon legacy lasted forever. However, the trust document contained a fatal flaw, a loophole buried in the dense legal language. It gave the trustees broad discretion to invade the principal for the welfare of the beneficiary, Richard. And critically, Richard eventually gained the power to appoint his own trustees. Standing over his mother's grave in 1965, Richard Mellon Scaife was 33 years old. He was now one of the richest men in America. He had a wife he didn't love, 2 infant children he barely knew, and a hole in his soul the size of Penguin Court. He looked at the money not as a stewardship, but as a weapon. He didn't want to preserve it for Jenny and David. He wanted to use it to punish the world that had judged him. The boy in the golden cage was gone. The blue-eyed demon was loose. He took the checkbook, and he prepared to burn down the world his mother had built, starting with the political establishment of the United States, using billions to destroy Bill Clinton and terrorize his family. The year 1965 marked the beginning of Richard Mellon Scaife's financial independence, but it also signaled the start of his descent into a specialized form of madness, fueled by unlimited resources. When the probate courts finished their work on his mother's estate, the 33-year-old Richard found himself in possession of a checkbook that could rewrite reality. He had hundreds of millions of dollars, but he had no job, no purpose, and a deep, festering resentment toward the world that had judged him as a spoiled heir. Most men in his position would have bought yachts or racehorses. Richard bought a weapon. His weapon of choice was a newspaper. In 1969, he purchased the Greensburg Tribune-Review, a small, sleepy daily paper in a working-class town outside of Pittsburgh. To the staff, the arrival of the billionaire owner was initially seen as a lifeline. They assumed he would invest in better equipment and higher salaries. They were wrong. Richard didn't buy the paper to report the news. He bought it to punish his enemies. He treated the newsroom not as a business, but as a personal fiefdom. He began to fire reporters who wrote stories he didn't like. He demanded that the editorial page reflect his own increasingly erratic and far-right worldview. He used the paper to launch vendettas against local politicians who had slighted him at dinner parties or refused his zoning requests. It was the first manifestation of his checkbook bullying, the realization that he could use his money to silence dissent and amplify his own voice. But a small-town paper was not enough to satisfy his hunger for validation. He wanted to be a kingmaker on the national stage. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, as the Vietnam War tore the country apart, Richard became obsessed with the idea that America was being destroyed by a conspiracy of communists, hippies, and the liberal media. He saw himself as the lone guardian of the Republic. He turned his attention to Richard Nixon. Scaife admired Nixon's paranoia. He saw a kindred spirit in the president's hatred of the press and his ruthless political instincts. In 1972, Scaife decided to buy his way into the White House. He circumvented campaign finance laws by writing 330 separate checks of $3,000 each to varying committees supporting Nixon's re-election, totaling $1 million, roughly $7 million today. It was a staggering sum, delivered in a way that was designed to avoid detection but maximize impact. He expected gratitude. He expected to be treated as an insider, a confidant. Instead, he was treated as an ATM. The Nixon White House took his money but mocked him behind his back. In secret tape recordings later released during the Watergate scandal, Nixon and his aides referred to Scaife as that eccentric and the guy with the money. They tolerated him, but they didn't respect him. When the Watergate scandal broke and Nixon was forced to resign in 1974, Scaife was not chastened. He was enraged. But his rage was not directed at Nixon's crimes. It was directed at the liberal media that had exposed them. He believed that the Washington Post and the New York Times had orchestrated a coup to destroy a patriot. This betrayal hardened his worldview. He decided that he would never again trust the mainstream media. Instead, he would build his own. This decision marked the beginning of his most dangerous phase. Throughout the 1970s, Richard Scaife began to pour millions of dollars into creating a counter-establishment. He funded think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and the American Spectator. He wasn't just donating to charity, he was building an ideological infrastructure designed to wage war on American culture. He wanted to create a world where his paranoia was treated as policy. But while he was trying to reshape the nation, his own home was becoming a war zone. The alcohol that had killed his mother was now consuming him. His drinking had progressed from a social habit to a full-blown destructive addiction. He drank gin by the quart. And when he drank, the blue-eyed demon emerged. His wife, Frances Ritchie Scaife, became the primary target of his drunken fury. He treated her not as a wife, but as a prisoner. He controlled her movements, monitored her phone calls, and subjected her to verbal abuse that was as creative as it was cruel. He would berate her for hours, critiquing her appearance, her intelligence, and her parenting. He isolated her from her friends, creating a domestic environment of terror where her only role was to manage his moods. The servants at Penguin Court whispered about the screaming matches that echoed through the halls. They saw the bruises on Ritchie's spirit, if not her body. Richard Scaife was a man who could charm a room of senators in the afternoon and then go home and terrorize his family until dawn. He was living two lives, the public philanthropist and the private monster. And as the 1970s bled into the 1980s, the monster was beginning to take over completely. The golden cage he had grown up in was now a prison he had built for others, and he held the only key. As the 1970s progressed, the walls of Penguin Court began to close in. Richard Scaife had expected his money to buy him respect in Washington. Instead, the Watergate scandal had left him feeling exposed and ridiculed. He retreated to his estate outside Pittsburgh, but he did not go quietly. He took his humiliation and fermented it into a vintage, high-proof paranoia. He became convinced that the liberal media, specifically the Washington Post and the New York Times, were not just biased organizations, but active agents of a communist conspiracy designed to destroy patriots like himself. He believed the CIA was monitoring his phone calls. He saw enemies in the shadows of his own garden. To combat these phantom threats, Scaife began to weaponize his philanthropy. He stopped giving money to traditional charities like the Red Cross or the local opera. Instead, he poured millions into creating an intellectual echo chamber. He became the primary financier of the Heritage Foundation and other right-wing think tanks. But his motivation was not purely ideological, it was psychological. He was buying friends. He surrounded himself with a court of sycophants, eager young ideologues and hard-bitten political operatives who were willing to nod at his drunken rants and validate his delusions in exchange for a check. They told him he was the savior of the republic, feeding the narcissism that the alcohol had already inflamed. But while he was being toasted as a visionary in the boardrooms of his think tanks, he was turning his home into a domestic black site. The Cold War was not just geopolitical for Richard Scaife. It was the defining dynamic of his marriage. His wife, Frances Richie Scaife, lived a life of terrified luxury. To the outside world, she was the perfect society wife, blonde, poised, and impeccably dressed. But behind the closed doors of their mansions in Ligonier and Nantucket, she was a hostage. Richard's drinking had evolved from a habit into a full-blown pathology. He drank gin like water, starting in the morning and continuing until he passed out at night. In his drunken states, Richard was not merely sloppy, he was sadistic. He engaged in relentless psychological torture. He would wake Richie up in the middle of the night to scream at her about imagined infidelities or failures. He controlled her every move, monitoring her odometer and timing her trips to the grocery store. He isolated her from her friends, convinced they were gossiping about him. The staff witnessed the degradation, the insults hurled at the dinner table, the way he would ignore her for days, treating her like a piece of furniture he had grown tired of. The children, Jenny and David, grew up in this atmosphere of volatility. They learned to read the weather of their father's moods, like sailors watching a storm front. They learned that the safest place to be was invisible. Richard showed them little affection. To him, they were not individuals. They were extensions of himself, and disappointing ones at that. He resented their needs and was jealous of the attention their mother gave them. He created a triangular dynamic where he competed with his own children for his wife's submission. By the 1980s, the rot in the marriage was total, but Richard refused to let go. He viewed divorce not as a separation, but as a loss of property, and Richard Scaife never lost property. Instead, he began to lead a double life. He spent more time at the offices of the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review, his newspaper. He filled the newsroom with yes men who were willing to print his vendettas. He used the paper to attack local zoning boards, rival socialites, and anyone who dared to look him in the eye. He was becoming the Caligula of the Alleghenies, a petty tyrant ruling over a kingdom of ink and fear. But his local grudges were not enough to satisfy his appetite for destruction. He needed a bigger target. He needed a villain worthy of his hate. In 1991, a young charismatic governor from Arkansas named Bill Clinton announced his candidacy for president. Richard Scaife watched him on television and felt a visceral, irrational loathing. Clinton represented everything Scaife despised. He was a liberal. He was a counterculture baby boomer who had dodged the draft, unlike Scaife, who had served in intelligence. And, perhaps most triggering of all, Clinton was a man of immense natural charm, the kind of effortless charisma that Scaife's billions could never buy. Scaife decided that Bill Clinton had to be destroyed. This obsession marked the transition to his most dangerous phase. He was no longer just a drunk abusing his wife. He was a drunk with $1 billion who wanted to overturn a Democratic election. He began to mobilize his assets. He told his editors at the Tribune-Review to dig up dirt on Clinton. He told his operatives at the foundations to look into Arkansas. He was preparing for a war. As the 1992 election approached, the blue-eyed demon was fully awake. He had the money, he had the media outlet, and he had the motivation. All he needed was a mechanism to turn his hatred into history. He was about to launch the Arkansas Project, a campaign of political assassination that would consume the nation for a decade, and which he would finance by stealing the future from his own children. When Bill Clinton was elected president in 1992, Richard Scaife took it as a personal insult. He viewed Clinton not as a political opponent, but as a moral contagion, a counterculture usurper who had defiled the White House. To purge this contagion, Scaife launched what would become known as the Arkansas Project. This was not a political campaign. It was a private intelligence operation. Scaife poured millions of dollars, money that legally belonged to the 1935 trust and thus to his children, into a slush fund managed by the American Spectator magazine. The goal was simple: dig up enough dirt to bury the president. He hired private investigators, former cops, and opposition researchers to scour the back roads of Arkansas. They were looking for mistresses, illegitimate children, drug deals, anything that could be weaponized. The project operated in the shadows. Investigators paid cash for stories. They tracked down state troopers who had once guarded Clinton, offering them book deals and legal defense funds in exchange for salacious details about the governor's sex life. This led directly to the Troopergate scandal, which in turn led to the Paula Jones lawsuit, the legal domino that would eventually topple into the Monica Lewinsky affair and impeachment. Richard Scaife was the invisible financier behind the entire chain of events. He was buying the destruction of a presidency, one check at a time. But Scaife's obsession soon moved from sex to death. In July 1993, Vince Foster, the deputy White House counsel and a close friend of the Clintons, was found dead in Fort Marcy Park. He had shot himself. 5 separate official investigations, including one by Ken Starr, concluded it was a tragic suicide brought on by depression and the pressure of Washington politics. Richard Scaife refused to believe it. To his paranoid mind, a suicide was too convenient. It had to be a murder. He turned his newspaper, the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review, into a conspiracy factory. He hired a reporter named Christopher Ruddy, who would later found Newsmax, and gave him a blank check to prove that Foster was murdered. For years, Scaife's paper pumped out a relentless stream of ghoulish fiction. They claimed the body had been moved. They claimed there was a magic bullet. They insinuated that the Clintons had ordered the hit to cover up the Whitewater scandal. Scaife was obsessed. He reportedly kept files of autopsy photos. He delighted in the gruesome details. He didn't care about the truth, and he certainly didn't care about the Foster family, who begged for the conspiracy theories to stop so they could mourn in peace. To Scaife, Vince Foster was not a human being. He was a prop in a grand narrative of evil that only Scaife could see. This was the Ken Un Zak Chet, vulture eating a corpse moment of his life. He was feasting on a tragedy. He spent millions of dollars to torment a grieving widow and 3 fatherless children, all to feed his own delusion that he was unmasking a killer. It was an act of profound cruelty, funded by the inheritance he was stealing from his own children. As the 1990s wore on, Scaife became the Wizard of Oz of the anti-Clinton movement. He was the man behind the curtain, pulling the levers of the vast right-wing conspiracy. But while he was hunting the president, his own life was collapsing. His drinking had reached a terminal phase. He was now consuming vodka by the gallon. His rages were legendary. He would scream at his staff, fire editors for fixing his grammar, and banish friends for minor slights. He was isolated, surrounded only by employees who were paid to agree with him. And then, in 1997, he turned his rage on the only person left in his inner circle, his wife, Richie. After 40 years of marriage, Scaife decided he was done with her. He had found a new object of affection, Margaret Ritchie Battle, a woman with the same first name as his wife but a different, more compliant demeanor. He didn't ask for a divorce, he declared it. The separation was brutal. He locked Ritchie out of their homes, he cut off her credit cards. He hired private investigators to follow her, looking for dirt he could use in court, a mirror image of his tactics against Clinton. He humiliated her in the press, leaking stories about her spending. He treated the mother of his children not as a partner, but as an enemy combatant to be crushed. The divorce was finalized, but the family was shattered. Jenny and David, now adults, watched in horror as their father destroyed their mother. They saw him for what he was, a bully who used his money to inflict pain. They sided with their mother. And for Richard Mellon Scaife, loyalty to the enemy was the ultimate sin. He decided to punish them. He couldn't kill them, so he did the next best thing. He decided to kill their future. He looked at the 1935 trust, the billion-dollar fund that was legally theirs, and he made a decision. He was going to drain it. He was going to spend every dime of their inheritance on his political wars and his new life, leaving them with nothing but his last name and his hatred. By 1998, Richard Mellon Scaife had achieved the grim pinnacle of his political vendetta. The Monica Lewinsky scandal broke in January, a detonation that Scaife viewed not as a news event, but as a return on investment. For nearly a decade, he had poured the 1935 trust money, his children's money, into the Arkansas Project, funding the private investigators, the lawsuits, and the conspiracy theories that had kept the Whitewater investigation alive long enough to stumble upon the blue dress. When the impeachment proceedings began, Scaife felt a dark, solitary vindication. He told his few remaining associates that he had saved the country. But this victory was Pyrrhic. The obsession had consumed him. He had become a caricature of the evil billionaire, mocked by the mainstream press and isolated in his fortress in Pittsburgh. The more the world called him a conspiracy theorist, the more he retreated into his own reality, a world where he was the hero and everyone else, including his own family, was a traitor. In this atmosphere of siege, Scaife finalized the erasure of his past life. In 1991, he had quietly married his mistress, Margaret Ritchie Battle. To the horror of his children, she went by the same nickname, Ritchie, as their mother. It was a psychological replacement, a way of erasing the first wife while keeping the name. He moved his new bride into his estates and systematically purged every trace of his previous family. Photos of Jenny and David were taken down. Their rooms were repainted. It was as if they had never existed. For Jenny and David Scaife, now adults in their 30s, the rejection was absolute. They watched from a distance as their father spent their inheritance on his political wars and his new life. They saw him on television, looking bloated and angry, railing against the Clintons. They read his newspaper, which published vicious attacks on anyone who questioned him. They realized that the man who had raised them was gone, replaced by a creature of pure bile. The tragedy was that Scaife did not hate his children because they had done anything wrong. He hated them because they were witnesses. They remembered who he used to be. They remembered the drunken rages, the abuse of their mother, the chaos of Penguin Court. To Richard, their very existence was an accusation. So he decided to punish them with the only weapon he valued, money. By the late 1990s, the 1935 Trust, the sacred vessel created by Sarah Mellon to ensure the family's wealth endured for generations, was in danger. The principle, which should have been growing through the greatest bull market in American history, was instead being drained. Scaife treated the trust not as a fiduciary responsibility, but as a personal slush fund. He began to liquidate assets. He sold off family stock. He demanded that the trustees, men he had handpicked for their loyalty, approve massive distributions of cash to fund his lifestyle and his newspaper. When the trustees hesitated, reminding him of his duty to Jenny and David, he fired them. He replaced them with yes-men, lawyers, and sycophants who would sign whatever he put in front of them. One of these men was H. Yale Gutnick, Scaife's longtime lawyer and enforcer. Gutnick was the architect of the legal wall that separated Scaife from his family. He helped Scaife construct a narrative that the children were greedy and undeserving, justifying the looting of their trust as a moral lesson. As 1998 drew to a close, the rise of the paranoiac was complete. Richard Mellon Scaife had destroyed the president's reputation, destroyed his own marriage, and destroyed his relationship with his children. He sat alone in his mansion, a blue-eyed demon king of a crumbling empire. He had won his political war, but he had lost his soul. And now, with no one left to stop him, he prepared to commit the final crime, the systematic secret theft of nearly $500 million from his own blood. The stage was set for the great betrayal, stealing $450 million from his own children. But to loot the trust, he needed accomplices. The original trustees, old-school bankers who took their fiduciary duties seriously, would never have allowed it. So in the early 1990s, Scaife initiated a quiet coup within his own family office. He bullied the independent trustees into resigning. In their place, he installed a new guard of yes-men, lawyers and sycophants who owed their careers entirely to him. The chief architect of this legal plunder was H. Yale Gutnick. Gutnick was not just a lawyer, he was Scaife's enforcer, his consigliere. A tough, street-smart attorney with a reputation for ruthlessness, Gutnick understood exactly what his client wanted. He constructed a legal argument that was breathtaking in its cynicism. Since Richard's happiness was the primary goal of the trust, and since running a newspaper at a loss made him happy, then draining the children's inheritance to fund the Tribune Review was a legitimate expense. With Gutnick's blessing, the spigot was open. Throughout the 1990s, Scaife began to withdraw massive sums from the 1935 Trust. The money didn't go to Jenny and David. It went to the Pittsburgh Tribune Review. The paper was a financial black hole, losing between $20 million and $30 million a year. But Scaife didn't care. He treated the paper as a money laundering operation for his ego. He poured the trust fund money into the paper, which then used that money to attack Bill Clinton, harass his enemies, and publish his paranoid ravings. In effect, Jenny and David Scaife were unwittingly funding the destruction of the American presidency. Their birthright was being converted into ink and bile. But the most chilling aspect of this era was the silence. Richard Scaife knew that if his children found out the scale of the theft, they could sue to stop him. So he instituted a regime of terror and isolation. Jenny Scaife, then, in her early 30s, was living a fragile existence in Florida. She was battling health issues and the emotional scars of her parents' brutal divorce. She relied on a monthly allowance from the trust to survive. Richard used this dependency as a leash. He made it clear through intermediaries like Gutnick that any questions about the family finances would be met with a total cutoff of funds. Don't ask about the principal was the unspoken rule. Be grateful for the allowance. David Scaife, quieter and more reserved than his sister, tried to build a life in Pittsburgh, but he was equally trapped. He watched his father from a distance, seeing him on television, red-faced and angry, railing against liberals. He saw the new wife, the new cars, the expansions to the estate. He knew there was money, but he had no idea that it was his money being spent. The tragedy of the 1990s was not just the theft, it was the deception. Richard Scaife maintained a facade of paternal benevolence. He would occasionally invite the children to holiday dinners, where the atmosphere was stiff with tension. He would ask about their lives with a cold, predatory detachment, checking to see if they suspected anything. He was playing a long con against his own flesh and blood. By 1999, as the Clinton impeachment trial concluded, Scaife had burned through hundreds of millions of dollars. The 1935 trust, which should have been growing in the booming stock market of the dot-com era, was shrinking. The principal, the golden egg that was supposed to last forever, was being eaten alive. Richard Scaife ended the decade triumphant in his political wars, but morally bankrupt in his private life. He had successfully divorced his first wife, erased his children from his daily existence, and secured a legal team that would sign off on any expense. He believed he had gotten away with it. He believed that Jenny and David were too weak, too dependent, and too afraid to ever challenge him. He did not realize that he was creating a pressure cooker. The great betrayal was not a single event. It was a slow-motion strangulation. And as the new millennium dawned, the King Lear of Pittsburgh was about to descend into a new level of madness that would finally push his children to break their silence. As the new millennium dawned, Richard Mellon Scaife entered the phase of his life that resembled a modern American retelling of King Lear, played out not on a heath, but in the hushed, liquor-soaked drawing rooms of Ligonier and Nantucket. He was approaching his 70s, but age had not softened him. It had merely calcified his malice. Having successfully purged his first family and his political enemies, he retreated into a new domestic arrangement that was supposed to be his reward, but which quickly devolved into a familiar nightmare. By the early 2000s, the dust had settled on his second marriage to Richie Battle, but the silence was expensive. Scaife utilized the welfare clause of the 1935 trust, which H. Yale Gutnick had unlocked for him, to fund a lifestyle that rivaled the excesses of the Gilded Age. He poured tens of millions of dollars into expanding his estates, building new wings, buying new jets, and collecting antique cars with the fervor of a man trying to fill a bottomless void. But the demons of addiction are patient. By 2002, the honeymoon was over, and the blue-eyed demon returned. Scaife's drinking, which had been managed during the courtship, exploded back into a full-blown crisis. He began to drink vodka for breakfast. His moods became volcanic. The staff at Valemont, his Pittsburgh estate, began to whisper about the screaming matches that lasted until dawn. The abuse that had destroyed his first marriage was replayed with terrifying fidelity in his second. Scaife turned on the new Richie. He became convinced that she was cheating on him, that she was only after his money, that she was laughing at him. He began to monitor her movements. He restricted her access to cash. He subjected her to the same verbal flayings that had broken his first wife. The golden cage had a new prisoner. While Richard was terrorizing his new wife, his children, Jenny and David, were living in a state of bewildered exile. They were now adults in their late 30s and early 40s, but they were treated like naughty children who had been sent to their rooms. While Richard was terrorizing his new wife, his children remained in their state of bewildered exile. Now adults in their late 30s and early 40s, Jenny and David watched from a distance as their father built a fortress to keep them out. They knew he was spending money, but they had no idea of the scale. They assumed the trust was infinite. They didn't know it was a finite bucket, and their father had drilled a hole in the bottom. The tragedy of this period, 2000 to 2005, was the total breakdown of the biological bond. Richard Scaife did not view Jenny and David as his legacy. He viewed them as waiting vultures. In his alcohol-fueled paranoia, he convinced himself that they were wishing for his death so they could get their hands on the money. This delusion became his justification for the theft. He told himself that by spending the money now, he was punishing them for their greed. He was spending their inheritance not just to enjoy it, but to deprive them of it. It was a preemptive strike against his own progeny. By 2005, the situation at Valemount had deteriorated into a domestic horror show. Richard Scaife was 73 years old, bloated, sick, and consumed by hatred. His second marriage was collapsing under the weight of his cruelty. His newspaper, the Tribune Review, was bleeding cash. He was a King Lear who had gone mad, but instead of wandering a heath in a storm, he was sitting in a leather chair, drinking gin, and signing checks that would bankrupt his bloodline. He was preparing for one final war, a divorce battle that would make his first one look like a skirmish, and which would inadvertently reveal the secret of the empty vault to the very people he had tried to hide it from. The dog-eat-dog phase of his life was about to begin. In late 2005, the police were called to the Scaife estate in Ligonier. Richie Battle had allegedly trespassed on the property to retrieve her favorite dog, a golden retriever named Beauregard. The incident exploded into the headlines. Richard Scaife, the billionaire power broker, had his wife arrested for dog napping. It was petty, vindictive, and absurd, but it was also a window into his soul. He cared more about controlling a dog than he did about the humiliation of his spouse. The divorce proceedings that followed were a carnival of cruelty. Scaife unleashed his lawyers, instructing them to leave Richie with nothing, but his most potent weapon was his newspaper. He used the Pittsburgh Tribune Review to publish thinly veiled attacks on his wife, leaking embarrassing details about their domestic life. He treated the divorce not as a legal separation, but as a scorched earth campaign to annihilate an enemy combatant. While the tabloids feasted on the dog war, Jenny and David Scaife watched in stunned silence. They saw their father repeating the exact same pattern of abuse he had inflicted on their own mother 30 years earlier. The déjà vu was sickening, but this time they noticed something else. They noticed the money. During the divorce discovery process, financial documents began to emerge that hinted at a terrifying reality. To fight Richie Battle and pay for his lifestyle, Scaife was burning through cash at an unsustainable rate. He was selling stocks, liquidating assets, and moving money between accounts with a frantic urgency. David Scaife, now a man in his 40s, with a family of his own, began to ask questions. He approached the trustees, the men who were legally obligated to protect his future, and asked for a simple accounting of the 1935 trust. The reaction was a wall of silence. H. Yale Gutnick and the other trustees stalled. They claimed the records were private. They claimed Richard had total discretion. They treated David not as a beneficiary, but as an intruder. This stonewalling in 2006 and 2007 was the first tremor of the coming earthquake. It signaled to Jenny and David that something was profoundly wrong. Why would the trustees hide the books if everything was in order? Why was their father so desperate for cash? Then came 2008. The global financial crisis hit. Markets collapsed. Fortunes evaporated overnight. In the chaos of the crash, the truth could no longer be hidden. The value of the Mellon fortune took a hit, but the 1935 trust didn't just shrink, it vanished. In late 2008, a whistleblower, or perhaps just a terrified accountant, leaked a piece of information to David Scaife that stopped his heart. The trust fund, which should have contained nearly $700 million, a conservative estimate based on decades of growth, was almost empty. It wasn't the market that had killed it, it was Richard. For 20 years, Richard Scaife and his enablers had systematically drained the principal. They had treated the trust like a personal ATM. They had withdrawn $450 million, effectively the entire core of the fortune, to fund the Tribune Review, the Arkansas Project, the divorces, the jets, and the golden retrievers. They had spent the children's birthright on Richard's vanity. The realization was shattering. Jenny and David had been robbed. They had been robbed by their own father, the man who had ignored them, bullied them, and exiled them. He hadn't just been a bad parent, he had been a thief. The great betrayal was complete. The vault was empty. The legacy of Sarah Mellon, the money she had set aside to protect her grandchildren from the world, had been consumed by the very monster she had created. As 2009 turned to 2010, Jenny and David Scaife faced a decision that no child should ever have to make. They could accept the theft and walk away, preserving the shred of family dignity that remained. Or they could do the unthinkable. They could sue their dying father. They chose war. They hired their own high-powered legal teams. They prepared to file a lawsuit that would accuse Richard Mellon Scaife of looting, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. They were going to drag the King Lear of Pittsburgh into court and demand to know, where did the money go? The looting phase was over. The war of the Scaifes was about to begin. The discovery of the empty vault in late 2008 was not just a financial shock. It was a psychological detonation that shattered the last remnants of the Scaife family structure. For 40 years, David and Jenny Scaife had lived under the oppressive weight of their father's mythology. They had been told that Richard was the genius steward of the Mellon fortune, the brilliant if eccentric philanthropist who was protecting their future. The revelation that he was, in fact, a common thief, a man who had pillaged their birthright to buy affection and political influence, destroyed the narrative of their entire lives. The years 2009 and 2010 were defined by a desperate, high-stakes game of cat and mouse between the children and the father. David Scaife, the quieter and more methodical of the two siblings, took the lead. He hired forensic accountants and aggressive trust litigators. They began to peel back the layers of the 1935 trust, demanding documents that H. Yale Gutnick and the other trustees had fought to keep hidden. What they found was a ledger of narcissism. The accounting record showed a pattern of distributions that had no relationship to the welfare of the beneficiary. There were withdrawals for the maintenance of the private jet fleet, which Richard used to fly his dogs to Nantucket. There were withdrawals to cover the massive operating losses of the Tribune Review, effectively forcing the children to subsidize their father's vanity press. There were withdrawals to pay the settlements for his divorces. Richard Scaife's reaction to his children's inquiries was not shame, but apoplectic rage. In his twisted worldview, the money was his. He believed that because it came from his mother, he had a divine right to spend it. regardless of the legal technicalities of the trust structure. He viewed David's questions as an act of patricidal treachery. He cut off all remaining contact. He ordered the trustees to stonewall. He retreated into his mansion at Valemount, surrounded by security guards and empty liquor bottles, a dying king refusing to open the gates. But the biological clock was ticking. Richard was diagnosed with cancer. The blue-eyed demon was fading. For Jenny and David, this created a terrifying deadline. They knew that if they waited until he died to sue, the money would be gone forever, dispersed into complex estates or charitable foundations where it would be impossible to claw back. They had to act while he was still alive. They had to drag their dying father into court and force him to answer for his crimes. It was an agonizing moral precipice. Suing a parent is a taboo in any culture, but in the secretive world of the American aristocracy, it was the ultimate in sin. It meant airing the family's dirty laundry in public. It meant confirming to the world that the Scaife dynasty was broken. In mid-2010, the siblings made their choice. They crossed the Rubicon. They formally notified the trustees that they intended to file a lawsuit to compel an accounting and to demand the restitution of the hundreds of millions of dollars that had been looted. The great betrayal had reached its inevitable conclusion. The father had eaten the children's future, and now the children were coming for the father. The era of silent suffering was over. The War of the Scaifes was about to begin, a legal Armageddon that would rage over the deathbed of a tycoon who had everything but love, leaving millions to dogs, but nothing to his kids. The year 2010 began not with a family reunion, but with a declaration of war. For decades, Jenny and David Scaife had lived in the shadows of their father's tyranny, accepting their exile and their allowance with the quiet resignation of hostages. But the discovery that the 1935 trust, their birthright, had been systematically drained of hundreds of millions of dollars broke the final bond of fear. They realized that their father, Richard Mellon Scaife, was not just a bad parent. He was an active predator who was consuming their future to feed his own present. In November 2010, the siblings crossed the Rubicon. They filed a formal petition in the Allegheny County Orphans Court to compel an accounting of the trust. It was a legal maneuver, but in the insular world of the Pittsburgh elite, it was a nuclear strike. Children of the aristocracy did not sue their fathers. They did not air dirty laundry. By filing the papers, Jenny and David were shattering the code of silence that had protected the family for a century. The lawsuit named 3 trustees as defendants, but the primary target was H. Yale Gutnick. To the children, Gutnick was the enabler, the legal architect who had rubber-stamped Richard's looting for 20 years. They accused him of breaching his fiduciary duty, of acting not as a guardian of the trust, but as a servant to Richard's whims. Richard Scaife's reaction was instantaneous and volcanic. He did not view the lawsuit as a legal dispute. He viewed it as an act of patricidal treason. In his alcohol-soaked worldview, the money was his. It came from his mother. The fact that it was legally designated for his children was a technicality he refused to recognize. He took the lawsuit as a personal insult, a sign that his children were greedy, ungrateful, and evil. He unleashed a counteroffensive that was breathtaking in its cruelty. He used his newspaper, the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review, to attack his own flesh and blood. He leaked stories portraying Jenny and David as spoiled, lazy trust fund babies who were waiting for him to die. He weaponized his own obituary before it was even written, telling associates that he would leave them nothing. But the most painful punishment was the isolation. Richard turned his estate, Valemount, into a fortress. He hired armed guards to patrol the perimeter. He instructed his staff that Jenny and David were never to be allowed on the property. He cut off all communication. The children were not just disinherited, they were erased. They became unpersons in the Scaife universe. As the legal machinery ground into gear in 2011, the family descended into a state of cold, trench warfare. The lawyers for Jenny and David demanded documents, bank statements, meeting minutes, expense reports. The lawyers for Richard and Gutnick stonewalled. They claimed executive privilege. They claimed the trust documents gave Richard absolute discretion. They fought every subpoena, dragging the process out to bleed the children's resolve. But Jenny and David did not blink. They were fueled by a lifetime of neglect. This was no longer about the money. It was about validation. They wanted a court of law to confirm what they had always suspected, that their father loved his money more than he loved them. While the lawyers fought in the courtroom, Richard Scaife sat alone in his mansion, a King Lear raging against the storm. He was 79 years old. His second marriage to Richie Battle had collapsed into a dog-eat-dog divorce war. He was estranged from his children. His friends were mostly employees on his payroll. He spent his days drinking gin and reading his own newspaper, surrounded by a court of sycophants who told him he was right, that his children were traitors, and that he was the victim. He was the richest man in Pittsburgh, but he was living in a prison of his own making. And in 2012, the walls of that prison began to close in even further. The discovery phase of the lawsuit was beginning to bear fruit. The judge was ordering the release of documents. The secrets of the looting, the private jets for dogs, the payoffs to mistresses, the millions wasted on conspiracy theories were about to be laid bare. Richard Scaife was facing the one thing he feared more than death: exposure. As the lawsuit ground into 2012 and 2013, the legal process moved into the phase known as discovery. For most defendants, this is a routine exchange of paperwork. For Richard Mellon Scaife, it was a forced strip search of his soul. The court ordered the trustees to hand over the financial records of the 1935 trust, the very documents they had guarded like state secrets for 20 years. When the boxes arrived at the offices of Jenny and David's lawyers, the contents were not just evidence of theft. They were a dossier of madness. The ledgers revealed a pattern of spending that was grotesque even by the standards of the ultra-rich. The children discovered that their inheritance had not been lost in bad investments or market crashes. It had been intentionally incinerated on vanity and spite. The most humiliating revelations concerned the dogs. The record showed that Richard had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars chartering private jets, not for himself but for his golden retrievers. When he wanted the dogs to travel between his estates in Pennsylvania and Nantucket, he would not subject them to a car ride. He hired a plane. The children, who had often struggled to get their father on the phone, realized that he had treated his pets with a tenderness and generosity he had never shown them. The dogs got the Gulf Stream. The children got the silence. But the animal extravagance was just the tip of the iceberg. The records exposed the true cost of his hatred. Millions of dollars had been funneled into the Arkansas Project and other political hit jobs. The trust fund had paid for the private investigators who dug through Bill Clinton's trash. It had paid for the conspiracy theory reporters at the Tribune Review. Jenny and David realized with horror that their money, the money intended to secure their children's future, had been used to finance the sordid decade-long attempt to destroy a president. Their birthright had been converted into political poison. Even more painful were the lifestyle expenses. The trust had been used to pay the settlements for Richard's divorces. It had paid for the jewelry given to mistresses. It had paid for the expansion of Valemont, a house the children were forbidden to enter. Every line item in the ledger was a slap in the face, a documented proof that Richard viewed his own pleasure as the only thing that mattered. As these secrets spilled out in depositions, Richard Scaife's physical health began to collapse. The alcohol, the rage, and the stress were finally taking their toll. He was diagnosed with an inoperable form of cancer. He grew frail, losing the imposing physical bulk that had once terrified his family. He was confined to a wheelchair, his skin turning gray, his voice a rasp. But the proximity of death did not bring clarity or repentance. It brought a final, scorched earth defiance. Richard told his lawyers to fight harder. He reportedly said he would rather burn the remaining money on legal fees than let those ungrateful bastards get a single cent. He viewed the lawsuit not as a quest for justice, but as an assassination attempt by his children. In late 2013, the situation at Valemount became gothic in its grimness. The dying billionaire was isolated in his fortress. His second wife, Richie Battle, was gone. His friends had largely abandoned him. He was surrounded only by paid staff, nurses, security guards, and the lawyers who were billing the trust by the hour to defend him against his children. Jenny and David, watching their father die from across the legal divide, were trapped in a unique hell. They knew he was dying, but they could not visit him. The security guards had strict orders, no children allowed. They were forced to receive updates on their father's condition through legal filings. They learned about his chemotherapy schedule from court briefs. The discovery phase had proven the theft, but it had not brought resolution. It had only deepened the wound. The children now knew exactly how much their father despised them. They had the receipts. And as 2014 dawned, they realized that they were running out of time. They wanted a reckoning, an apology, or at least an explanation. But the blue-eyed demon was preparing for his final act, and he had no intention of giving them peace. He was going to take his hate to the grave. As the winter of 2014 settled over the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, the atmosphere inside the Valemount estate shifted from a siege to a death watch. Richard Mellon Scaife, the billionaire who had once made presidents tremble with his checkbook, was now a prisoner of his own biology. The cancer had metastasized. He was bedridden, hooked up to oxygen, his body wasting away into a skeletal husk. But while his physical strength evaporated, his capacity for cruelty remained intact, distilled by pain into a pure, potent venom. This was the final grotesque tableau of the King Lear drama. The man who had spent a lifetime buying influence found himself utterly alone at the end of it. His second wife was gone, divorced and destroyed. His first wife was a distant memory. His children were suing him. The halls of the mansion were empty of laughter or family. They were populated only by a rotating cast of paid employees, nurses who changed his sheets, security guards who patrolled the grounds, and the lawyers who sat by his bedside, billing by the hour to ensure his hatred was codified into law. For Jenny and David Scaife, this period was a torture of the soul. Despite the lawsuit, despite the theft, despite decades of emotional abuse, the primal bond of child to parent pulled at them. They knew their father was dying. They faced a terrifying deadline. The final door was closing. They wanted closure. They wanted to look him in the eye one last time, perhaps to scream, perhaps to forgive, or perhaps just to see if there was a flicker of recognition in the blue eyes of the demon. In early 2014, David made an attempt. He drove to the gates of Valemount. He was the son of the owner. He had grown up playing on these grounds. But when he arrived, he was stopped by a private security team. They were not family retainers. They were hired muscle. They checked a list. "I'm sorry, Mr. Scaife," the guard told him. "You are not on the list." David was turned away from his father's deathbed like a stranger crashing a party. The orders had come directly from the sick room. Richard had explicitly instructed his staff that his children were to be barred. He did not want their pity. He did not want their forgiveness. He wanted to die as he had lived, in total undisputed control, punishing them with his absence until the very last breath. Jenny Scaife in Florida was spared the humiliation of the gate, but her suffering was no less acute. She received updates on her father's condition through the cold filter of legal correspondence. She learned that he was lucid, that he was holding court with his favorite reporters from the Tribune Review, giving final interviews where he railed against his enemies and rewrote his own history. She realized that he had energy for hate, but none for her. The most chilling aspect of these final months was the presence of the sycophants. As Richard weakened, a circle of hangers-on tightened around him. There was his longtime aide, Dick Larry, and his attorney, H. Yale Gutnick. To the children, these men were the gatekeepers, the enablers, who had helped loot the trust and were now managing the end game to protect themselves. Jenny and David suspected that these men were filtering access not just to protect Richard's health, but to ensure he didn't have a last-minute change of heart. They feared that if Richard saw his children, he might soften, might change the will, might expose the helpers. So the gatekeepers kept the gate shut. Inside the sick room, Richard Scaife was busy orchestrating his final act of spite. He wasn't just dying. He was planning. He called for his estate lawyers. He wanted to review his will one last time. He wanted to make absolutely sure that the language was ironclad. He wanted to ensure that the nothing he was leaving his children was legally binding. He also turned his attention to his newspaper. He dictated a farewell column. In it, he spoke of his love for Pittsburgh, his passion for journalism, and his belief in America. He did not mention his children. He did not mention his wives. It was a public performance of benevolence from a man who was privately engaged in the destruction of his own bloodline. By May 2014, Richard was fading fast. The lawsuit was technically still active. The war of the Scaifes was being fought on paper while the general lay dying. The lawyers for the children filed emergency motions, trying to depose him before he died, trying to get answers about the missing millions while he could still speak. But Gutnick and the defense team stalled. They claimed he was too sick to answer questions. They ran out the clock. On July 3rd, 2014, Richard Mellon Scaife turned 82. It was a birthday celebrated in a mausoleum. There was no party. There were no calls from his children allowed through to his room. He lay in the dark, listening to the hum of medical machinery, the richest man in Pittsburgh and the poorest father on earth. The end came just hours later. In the early morning of July 4th, 2014, Independence Day, a fitting date for a man who worshipped his own autonomy above all else, Richard Mellon Scaife died. He died as he had lived, angry, unrepentant, and alone. His hand was not held by a daughter or a son. It was likely held by a nurse or a lawyer. The blue-eyed demon was gone. The silence that fell over Valemount was absolute. But for Jenny and David, the death was not the end of the pain. It was the beginning of the final insult. They learned of their father's death not from a family member, but from the news alerts on their phones. The Tribune Review published the obituary instantly, a glowing tribute to a patriot and philanthropist. The children were left to process the grief of losing a father they had already lost decades ago, but they didn't have time to mourn. They had to wait for the will. They knew he had hated them, but they still held onto a sliver of hope. Maybe at the very end, he had remembered them. Maybe there was a secret letter, a token, a gesture of reconciliation from beyond the grave. They were wrong. When the will was unsealed in the days that followed, it wasn't a gesture of love. It was a slap in the face that would echo in the probate courts for years. Richard had saved his cruelest trick for last. The funeral of Richard Mellon Scaife in July 2014 was a surreal event, a gathering of the political elite he had funded and the sycophants he had employed, all mouthing pieties about a man they secretly feared. But for Jenny and David Scaife, the ceremony was irrelevant. The real funeral took place in a lawyer's office days later, with the breaking of the seal on the last will and testament. The children braced themselves. They knew their father had emptied the 1935 trust, the family piggy bank he had raided for decades. But Richard was still a billionaire in his own right. He had personal assets, houses, art, stocks, worth hundreds of millions of dollars that were separate from the looted trust. They hoped with a desperate, childlike optimism that he might have left them something from this personal fortune, a final acknowledgement of their bond. When the lawyer read the terms, the room went cold. Richard Mellon Scaife had left his children nothing, not a dollar, not a cufflink, not a photograph. He had explicitly disinherited them from his personal estate. Instead, the will was a masterpiece of spiteful distribution. He left millions to the Allegheny Foundation and the Sarah Scaife Foundation, ensuring his political crusades would continue from beyond the grave. He left generous bequests to his loyal staff, the drivers, the pilots, the secretaries who had guarded his gate, but the final twist of the knife was reserved for the animals. Richard left a specific, well-funded trust to care for his golden retrievers. He ensured that his dogs would live out their days in luxury, flying on private jets and eating steak, while his daughter Jenny struggled to pay her medical bills. It was the ultimate message. I loved my dogs more than I loved you. To Jenny and David, this wasn't just greed, it was a posthumous assault. But the will also contained a legal landmine designed to protect his accomplices. It included clauses that indemnified the trustees, specifically H. Yale Gutnick, from liability. Richard had tried to build a legal firewall from the grave to stop his children from suing the men who had helped him steal their money. The children were devastated, but they were also liberated. The hope of reconciliation was dead. The only thing left was justice. In late 2014, the lawsuit they had filed in 2010 shifted gears. It became a full-blown war against the estate and the trustees. With Richard dead, the sentimental barrier was gone. David Scaife's legal team unleashed a forensic blitzkrieg. They demanded the repayment of the $450 million that Richard had looted from the 1935 trust. Their target was no longer their father, but the enablers, the three trustees who had signed the checks, H. Yale Gutnick, James Walton, and George Weymouth. The lawsuit argued that these men had breached their fiduciary duty. Their job was to protect the trust for the beneficiaries, Jenny and David, not to act as Richard's personal ATM. By allowing Richard to drain the principal to zero, they had failed in their legal obligation. The trustees fought back. They argued that the terms of Sarah Mellon's original will gave Richard broad discretion to use the money for his welfare. They argued that keeping Richard happy was their job, but the optics were terrible. The image of three wealthy men helping a billionaire steal from his children to fund right-wing conspiracy theories was indefensible in the court of public opinion. As the case headed toward a trial in 2015, the pressure mounted. The trustees realized they were facing a potential verdict that could bankrupt them personally. In May 2015, the War of the Scaifes reached its legal climax. Just before the trial was set to begin, a settlement was reached. The details were confidential, but sources indicated that the trustees and the estate agreed to pay Jenny and David a sum in the range of $100 million. It was a victory, but a hollow one. They had recovered a fraction of what was stolen. The bulk of the money, the $450 million, was gone, burned up in the Tribune Review's printing presses and the Arkansas Project's legal fees. But for Jenny Scaife, the victory came too late. The stress of the lawsuit, combined with her lifelong battle with the trauma of her upbringing, had shattered her health. The war was over, but the casualties were just beginning to be counted. The vault was empty, the father was dead, and the daughter was dying. The final act of the tragedy was about to play out, proving that the Scaife curse was not about money, but about the impossibility of survival in a family without love. The settlement of May 2015 was not the end of the family's destruction. It was merely the autopsy report. The legal battle had confirmed the theft of the century. $450 million had been drained from the 1935 trust, leaving the children with a fraction of their intended inheritance. But the true cost of the War of the Scaifes was not measured in dollars. It was measured in the psychological disintegration of the victors. Jenny Scaife, who had fought her father's ghost to a standstill, found that winning the lawsuit did not heal the wound of his hatred. It only confirmed that she had been right to feel unloved. In the years following the settlement, Jenny's health began a rapid, tragic decline. She had always been fragile, battling the emotional scars of her parents' brutal divorce and the cold isolation of her childhood. But the stress of the litigation, the years of reading depositions detailing her father's cruelty, the realization that he had spent her money on his dogs rather than her well-being, broke her spirit. She retreated into her estate in Florida, a wealthy woman surrounded by the silence of a family that had ceased to exist. Her brother, David Scaife, used his share of the settlement to retreat further into privacy. He understood the lesson his father had taught him. In the Scaife family, visibility is dangerous. He focused on his own family, trying to break the cycle of neglect. But the shadow of Valamont loomed over him. He was the son of a man who had tried to rob him, and no amount of money could erase that identity. But the final casualty of the war was the Scaife legacy itself. Richard Mellon Scaife had spent his life trying to build a political empire that would reshape America. He wanted to be remembered as the man who saved the Republic from liberalism. Instead, the lawsuit exposed the machinery of his influence as a fraud funded by stolen money. The Tribune Review was revealed not as a successful newspaper, but as a vanity project on life support. The Arkansas Project was exposed as a witch hunt financed by embezzled funds. When the dust settled in late 2015, the empire of influence that Richard had built was crumbling. Without the flow of illegal cash from the trust, his foundations had to tighten their belts. The newspaper began to shrink, laying off staff and closing bureaus. The political hit machine ran out of fuel. Richard had built a monument to his own ego, but he had built it on a foundation of theft, and with his death the foundation collapsed. The War of the Scaifes proved that the greatest enemy of the American aristocracy is not the taxman or the socialist. It is the father. Richard Mellon Scaife had been given everything: money, status, power, but he lacked the one thing that sustains a dynasty: the ability to care for the next generation. He died a King Lear who had destroyed his kingdom to spite his children, leaving behind nothing but a vault full of dust and a family tree withered by hate. The lonely end of the Scaife dynasty. In the aftermath of the 2015 settlement, Jenny Scaife retreated to her estate in Palm Beach, Florida. She was now a woman of immense independent wealth, having secured a settlement rumored to be in the range of $100 million. But the victory in the courtroom did not translate to a victory in life. The legal war had been a unifying purpose, a crusade to force her father's ghost to acknowledge her existence. With the war over, the silence returned, louder and more oppressive than before. Jenny's health, already fragile from years of battling the emotional trauma of her upbringing, began a precipitous decline. She had spent her adult life fighting a two-front war, one against her father's neglect and one against her own body. The stress of the litigation, the years of reading depositions detailing how Richard Scaife had prioritized his dogs over his daughter, had accelerated her physical deterioration. She became a recluse, surrounded by the trappings of luxury, but isolated by the suspicion that money was the only language her family spoke. On November the 29th, 2018, just 3 years after winning her inheritance back, Jenny Scaife died at her home in Florida. She was 55 years old. Her death was sudden, but not surprising to those who knew the depth of her pain. She died of natural causes, but her friends and the few family members who remained spoke of a broken heart. She had died without ever receiving the one thing she truly wanted, a father who loved her. The $100 million settlement had not bought back the years of estrangement. It had merely funded a more comfortable end. Her obituary noted her philanthropy and her love of animals, a trait she ironically shared with her father, but it could not hide the tragedy of a life cut short by the toxic atmosphere of the Scaife dynasty. With Jenny's death, the burden of the legacy fell entirely on the shoulders of her brother, David Scaife. David, now the sole survivor of Richard's immediate bloodline, chose a path of radical privacy. He understood the lesson that had killed his sister. In the Scaife family, visibility is dangerous. He retreated to his estate in Shadyside, Pittsburgh, becoming a ghost in the city his family had built. David's response to the trauma was to attempt a quiet, methodical repair of the karma his father had destroyed. He began to direct his portion of the recovered trust money toward genuine philanthropy. He supported the arts, education, and local charities, but he did so without the fanfare or the political strings that had defined Richard's giving. He was trying to wash the money clean, but the shadow of Valemont loomed over him. He was the son of a man who had tried to rob him, and no amount of quiet charity could erase the fact that his fortune was the result of a lawsuit against his own father. Meanwhile, the physical monuments to Richard Mellon Scaife's ego began to crumble. The Pittsburgh Tribune-Review, the newspaper that Richard had looted his children's trust to keep alive, could not survive without his injected millions. In 2016, the paper ceased its daily print publication, retreating to a digital-only format. The newsroom that had once hunted Bill Clinton was hollowed out. The printing presses, which had churned out conspiracy theories for decades, went silent. The paper became a zombie brand, a digital ghost of the political weapon it once was. The political machine Richard had built also began to rust. The Arkansas Project was a relic of the 90s. The think tanks he had funded moved on to new donors with new grievances. Without the steady stream of Scaife cash, the specific paranoid brand of conservatism that Richard had championed, personal, vindictive, and obsessed with conspiracy, faded into the background, replaced by the louder, more chaotic populism of the Trump era. Richard Scaife had spent $500 million trying to shape history, but history had moved on without him. As the decade closed, the most haunting image of the Scaife legacy was not a building or a law, but a house. Valemont, the fortress in Ligonier where Richard had died alone, stood empty. The gates were locked. The rooms where he had screamed at his wives and plotted against his children were silent. The only residents were the ghosts of a family that never was. And in a final bitter irony, The trust fund for the golden retrievers continued to pay out. The dogs lived in luxury, cared for by staff, oblivious to the fact that they were the only creatures Richard Scaife had ever truly trusted. The ultimate verdict on the Scaife dynasty is a grim lesson in the limitations of inheritance. Richard Mellon Scaife proved that it is possible to be born with everything and die with nothing but contempt. He inherited a name that built America, Mellon, and he left behind a name that is now synonymous with family destruction, Scaife. His life was a masterclass in the transmutation of gold into lead. He took a fortune built on industry and banking and converted it into a fortune built on spite and litigation. In 2024, the physical remnants of his empire are fading, but the psychological scars remain vivid. The 1935 trust, once a billion-dollar engine of prosperity, is a closed ledger, a forensic crime scene studied by trust lawyers as a cautionary tale of fiduciary failure. The Arkansas Project is a footnote in history books about the Clinton impeachment, a reminder of how one man's obsession can warp a national dialogue. But the most enduring legacy is the silence of the bloodline. David Scaife, the last survivor, lives a life defined by its distance from his father. He has used his recovered inheritance to support causes that are the antithesis of Richard's crusades, quiet, community-focused philanthropy that seeks to heal rather than destroy. He is raising his own children in a world where the name Richard is rarely spoken, trying to break the generational curse of the blue-eyed demon. The story of the Scaife family is, in the end, a tragedy of emotional poverty amidst material abundance. It is a story about a mother who loved penguins more than her son, and a son who loved dogs more than his children. It is a story where the only warmth came from the friction of lawsuits, and the only intimacy was the shared hatred of a divorce court. Richard Mellon Scaife believed he could buy history. He believed he could buy loyalty. He believed he could buy peace. He died proving that while you can buy a newspaper to print your lies and a lawyer to defend your thefts, you cannot buy a legacy that survives the truth. The vault is empty, the house is cold, and the only thing that remains of the billionaire who ate his children is the cautionary whisper of his name in the halls of the family office. Money does not protect you from yourself.